Marcio, please come and join us. In preparation for this, we've run a poll on the Responsible Tourism blog site for the last 3 months. And I haven't seen what we're about to see either. In fact, it was only put together an hour or so ago. But it is the major issues. I have to say that is a relief. I was very worried that carbon wouldn't come out at the top of the list of major issues. Carbon, then water, waste, local economic development, biodiversity, child protection, decent jobs, modern slavery, inclusive tourism, migration, animal welfare and disability. If I'm honest, I'm also surprised that animal welfare is so far down the list in terms of the numbers of people we have at the various panels and seminars we've run over the years. So that, if you like, is the public voice and the public view. The actual figures. It is disappointing that we perhaps didn't get more participants in the poll. And obviously with no idea, please come and join us, Minister. It's a pity we didn't get more participants, and we don't, of course, know how representative that sample is. But we wanted to do it really as an introduction to what we're going to do now, which is I've asked each of these good people to publicly tell us what they think are the 3 priorities for responsible tourism over the next 5 years. And Rebecca, who's over there at the laptop, Marcio, come and join us. Rebecca is going to make live notes, so please forgive her typos as she does it. But she's going to make live notes so that we can flash up at the end what the panel's view is of the most important issues for the next 5 years. Now, this is in part, of course, shaping our agenda for WTM sessions moving forward. Although I have to say we shall still enjoy a little licence to do some other things as well. But Jane, if I may, could we start with you? Jane Ashton from TUI. What are your... Have you got the microphone? Please go ahead, Jane.
Okay, well, my 3 priority areas for the next 5 years for responsible tourism were starting with carbon. And my feeling was with the outcome from the Paris Agreement, the evidence that's been shown to the world from the UNFCCC, what we've seen before our own eyes this past year in terms of extreme weather events, that none of us can doubt that we have to be part of helping the world decarbonise to the tune of 80% plus by 2050, and tourism, as the world's largest industry, has to play its role in that. So for us at TUI Group, that means increased effort on driving carbon and energy use down through our shops, offices, brochures, ground transport, critically our hotels, critically our airlines. So a huge ask for the travel industry. The good thing is that it does make business sense, so driving down energy does actually uncover a huge amount of business costs, but also investment in renewables, investment in new tech. But next 5 years will be a challenge. There'll be no short-term alternative to kerosene on the horizon, so big challenge for aviation. My second area was local economic benefit. We know that tourism is a massive driver of economic benefit, but it could be doing more. So for us, that means increased focus on developing vocational programs for young people in the destinations where we operate, increased focus on trying to get more SMEs and local entrepreneurs involved in the tourism value chain. So working with our suppliers on that, working through our destination project partners on that. My third area, and I oscillated here between water and waste, I plumbed for waste in the end, thinking that actually in terms of our hotel's water footprint, 80% plus is actually in the embedded food and beverage that's used in the hotels. So by addressing the issues of food waste, we're also addressing the issue of water consumption from the tourism industry. But not only food waste, focus on solid waste, and in terms of destination governments, a focus on sound waste infrastructure. And I think we all know of many destinations where the waste infrastructure is sadly not adequate, and that has big environmental impacts. It has a big impact on the enjoyment of our customers. So for me, it was carbon, economic benefit, and waste.
Thanks very much indeed, Jane. So next it's Nikki White from ABTA.
Thank you, Harold. Now, I know you like to be a disruptor, so I'm following your model, and I didn't choose 3. Because I didn't think I could do, and I had deep conversations with many people around this agenda while I was trying to come to my conclusions. And firstly, I think it depends on your audience. So I had to think about, okay, who are we talking about here? And ultimately, it has to be about the destinations and to have thriving destinations. But if you were to think about the different players' roles in this, they may well all choose different options. So if you're a tour operator, you might have a different agenda to a travel agent, to a cruise ship, to a destination. So I've taken the premise that it's about destinations and helping them thrive. So for me, it's all about sustainable destination management and having a plan in place to actually manage the issues that are specific to your destination. I think by actually splitting them out and deciding which ones are the main priorities could miss the point in some of the destinations. Each destination, as we see through the data that we collect, have very specific issues that they need to address themselves. But if you don't start with a plan of what your destination is actually trying to achieve, then you could actually go down the wrong avenue on thinking about one particular aspect of the list here and missing something that for your destination is the vital thing to actually manage. I think linked to that is all about responsibility. So it's looking from, said, the main agenda of having a plan in place, that responsible destination management, through to responsibility in a finite world, as we defined in our plan a number of years ago. And I think that still holds true. So it's thinking about all of the different items that were on the poll and what responsibility a destination needs to think about for each of those different items on there. Because as we've seen, some destinations, waste is critical for them, and it actually has large implications, not just for the aesthetics of a destination, but the health and safety as well. So the interconnectedness there. So the more I was thinking about it, the more I think, yep, there are interconnectedness between all the different issues here. Inclusive tourism, we have on the list there as well. That could actually mean accessibility. So splitting the two out, how can we actually say which one is more important than the other? So I'm afraid I've gone for something slightly more radical for a change and not stuck to the brief. And I've gone for thinking about sustainable destination management as a whole.
Rebecca, I think the answer is to put destination management in red. Because it's 3 votes. Libby, people want... Well, I mean, that's 3 of... Yes, 3 votes on the one, yeah. Libby. You won't know, many of you won't know who Libby is, but she works out in the East, and I thought it would be a good idea to try and have a voice from somebody who works in a lot of countries in the Far East, and to look at it from that perspective.
So actually, I've chosen one, and it's energy and carbon. And for me, they're both directly linked to the biggest environmental challenge that our generation has ever seen. And rising carbon emissions are continuing to accelerate the impacts of climate change, and the negative impacts on communities and biodiversities, particularly in developing countries and islands, small island states that I work in, is absolutely already devastating. And I think as we sit here at WTM, we need to think about the backdrop this year of the devastating hurricanes, the fires, the floods, the droughts, the melting ice in places like Pakistan and Afghanistan, and the impact this is having on destinations. Tourism has played a role, definitely, in the imbalance of our planet, and the figure is that of all the carbon emissions, 5% is coming from tourism, of which 4% is from the aviation sector and 1% is from hotels. And I think there's some pretty horrifying figures, certainly from the aviation sector, and I think this is something that we really, really need to focus on, putting more pressure on airlines to reduce their carbon emissions. I mean, it's definitely one of the fastest growing sources of carbon emissions, the aviation sector. It's the most carbon intensive form of transport. It's between 1990 and 2012, carbon emissions grew by more than 80%. And to put that into perspective, that's almost double the average carbon emissions from other sectors, any other sector in the world. So definitely, I think the scary thing is that the aviation sector continues to grow. We're seeing regulatory and taxation policies which are changing, and they're not necessarily in line, or they don't reflect the true environmental impacts of aviation. The growth of low-cost airlines, yeah, well, great, cheap fares, but cheap fares at what cost? And the cost to the environment is far outweighing the benefits of many more people traveling. From the hotel perspective, I think for me, one of the most shocking figures that came out last week in the Decarbonisation Hotel Report was that hotels need to reduce their carbon footprint by 90% in order to meet the Paris Agreement. So in the next 13 years, hotels need to reduce their energy and carbon by 66% and a further, well, not a further, but a total of 90% by 2050. And these, between the aviation sector and the hotel sector, they're enormous figures to achieve. So I think, we really need to focus on these two things.
Debbie, I'm slightly surprised you haven't mentioned forests as well, because in a way, potentially tourism could encourage people to visit forests and could encourage the maintenance of forests. It's a big issue in your part of the world.
Yeah, I live in Indonesia, and it is the fifth biggest emitter of carbon, and primarily because of the palm oil sector, which is directly related to deforestation. Yes, tourism definitely can play a role, but for me, I think the kind of elephant in the room is the aviation sector from a tourism perspective, and certainly this shocking figure that came out last week about hotels.
Thanks very much. Minister, you speak for South Africa. And can I say a particular thank you to you for coming on the panel, because most ministers don't actually want to face the questions. But I'm delighted to have you here. How do you see it from South Africa's perspective?
I hope it works. Thank you very much. I can see the panel has got a lot of women. Thank you very much. I think we have selected three areas. The first one is, I think it's adding to what has been said by the speakers already around resource efficiency, environmental protection, and climate change issues, that tourism has to be responsible to also contribute to this, because as a sector we depend much more on the natural environment, and we have therefore a special responsibility onto the planet. We have specifically made interventions in the country around the matter. I'll just demonstrate it by one example. For instance, we have 9 UNESCO heritage sites, which is what we have prioritized in the years to come. We have started with the first one, where we have saved them about 45% of diesel usage for their electrification or for their energy use. So that in itself has been a start, and it made us to even launch an incentive program and a green fund so that private sector can begin to participate and work with small enterprises to get into the space. The second aspect that we have identified is the issue of tourism safety. Because with tourism, as people would come, appreciate our environment and our attractions, we also want to provide every tourist and everybody a friendly environment, a politically stable environment, and a socially acceptable environment. So in that way, we have introduced, for instance, what we call tourism safety monitors. And these are young people who really provide that flavor, trained, but also critical onto it. They create much more awareness in the communities around the broad spectrum of what tourism is and what its value and how to preserve in order to keep for generations what we have to preserve. And the other one is where we are targeting to reach to those areas in the rural areas and in the township where we contribute to sustainable rural communities. And with it, it's where we are making several interventions to train in skills people who create awareness in the communities, but also help identify the kind of products that would assist in order to grow tourism, and you find that you don't have a situation where there's influx into other corners of the country, less into others, because it also would have impact, a negative impact in terms of migration in the areas. So that's what we've targeted ourselves.
So that's another one for local economic benefit, I think, Rebecca. Thank you very much, Minister. Martin Brackenbury.
Harold, well, I've come down in favour of much better destination management, actually, as the first one, and within the context of over-tourism. We've been talking about this quite a lot, obviously, over the past year, and particularly here at WTM, and there's an increasing body of evidence which demonstrates that we need much better and more inclusive approaches to destination management than we have used hitherto. We've always concentrated on promotional aspects, where actually real money needs to be spent on destination management issues, and remembering the fact that when we talk about responsible tourism, we're talking about places which are good for people to live in, and if in some ways we actually make it less good, then it doesn't work. So it's got to be better for people to live in, and therefore destination management is the key thing. And the focus on over-tourism, in which too many people are going not only to cities but also to national parks and other areas, and how those can be managed more effectively so that they become better places for people to live in and benefit from. I think destination management is number one. Now, the question of carbon I put at number two. One of the problems about carbon is a question of us keeping up the pressure to make certain that the changes are brought about. Because if you think about aircraft, anybody here, we have zero impact on the technological developments and changes which are brought about in the engine manufacturers or in the manufacturer of the aircraft themselves. So it's pressure that we bring to bear. The same is true of cars. Cars are changing now relatively rapidly. We're seeing that there's a marked drop in this country in sales of diesel cars and so on over the last 2 or 3 months. And it's been the alternatives of actually buying better cars which are of much less impact on the environment, particularly things relating not just to CO2 but to NOx. It's demonstrating that people begin to see that they can make money out of all these things. So it's a question of keeping up the pressure so that these changes are brought about very quickly rather than over a considerable period of time. And I think that's more our role. And that relates also to airports and cruise ships and large vehicles and accommodation of all sorts. I was going to mention as a third one, it is really, I think there's a lot of work has gone on, and quite successfully, but more needs to be done on inclusive tourism in communities in which local people are brought in. I've worked with Harold in the Gambia on these things, and it's very interesting work, and massive improvements can be made to people's lives by having ways of bringing people into the supply chain in particular. So that's my three.
Thanks very much, Martin. And finally, Marcio Favilla from UNWTO.
Thank you.
Your position or UNWTO's we're going to have? I hope it's your preferences.
My position is aligned with that of UNWTO.
Excellent.
Because I have helped to shape that position. So I should stand for that because I also believe. I think, Harold, Martin mentioned here, what is responsible tourism about? It's about making better places to live in and better places to visit. That is responsible tourism, the combination of both. So I would like to bring the attention to the fact that here we have roles for all stakeholders. We have roles for governments, we have roles for the private sector, and we also have a role for the tourists themselves, the visitors. So all stakeholders have a role in shaping that destination to be a better place for local people to live in and also to visit. And another, let's say, overall consideration is that we are talking about, to my view, both domestic and international tourism. Let's not forget that besides the 1.2 plus billion people that travel every year internationally, we have more than 7 billion people traveling within their national borders. So overall, the tourism phenomenon we are talking about here. So I would, Harold, let's say, focus basically on two groups of policies or priorities. One is on the social responsibility, I would call the social responsibility overall, which under that we are talking about empowering women at the local level. We are empowering the young people so that they can have access to the labor market, so they can start their business, the small business that in the future will be a bigger business and will be able to employ lots of people. I'm talking about caring for indigenous people, involving them or not, depending on how they see tourism. And if they want tourism, we have to help them and work with them and listen to them and how they will receive tourists. We have to care for the people with disabilities, the people that travel at an older age, people that travel with children, people with difficulties to move, whether they are permanent or temporary. Here, under social responsibility, I'm talking about generating decent work, good jobs for the young people, so that and others, so that young people can see a career in tourism, and of course respecting the local culture. So there are many different issues, but overall I would call a priority on social responsibility. The good Minister of South Africa gave us numerous examples of policies that they are putting in place, she's putting in place in South Africa in that regard. The second overall priority is on the environmental sustainability. We have to make sure that tourism growth is or be disconnected or decoupled from the use of natural resources, the intensive use of energy, the intensive use of biodiversity. And that is, of course, a climate change agenda that is very important. But on the ground, or whether it is from the hotels or the airline builders, that is very important. But there is a role here for the tour operators, as we have heard here, to develop new products or different products that will not only decouple that use of the growth from the use of natural resources and generate less waste, but also to help diversify those tourism products, and tourism be a contributor, a net contributor to the environment. So I would, so to answer, because your question, what are the priorities of responsible tourism in the next 5 years? So I would classify into both, or the two: social responsibility policies and environmental sustainability policies. Thank you.
I obviously deliberately chose a panel which would challenge me. I'll come back to you in a minute, Nikki. But Inga, you've just joined us from Carlson Residor. What were your 3 priorities for the next 5 years?
Well, I think it's exciting to see the priorities and the results of the research here on the screen, and some are surprises and some are not. So I'm just going to speak on behalf of Carlson Residor. We are 1,100 hotels in 115 countries. So for us, of course, the number one in terms of impact is resource efficiency, meaning caring about carbon and water, which is actually 2 that I can bring under 1. We've had a long history of reducing our impacts both on energy and carbon and on water, and I think we need to, both as an individual company and also collectively as a hotel industry, we need to work on those 2 points. The second one which I would choose is absolutely inclusive tourism for communities, which also links to the local economic development. I just came from the UNWTO summit, and we discussed over-tourism. And one of the reasons that communities in various destinations react so violently or so strongly against tourism is because the positive ripple effects of tourism do not spread out enough. So I think in terms of inclusive communities, it is about creating jobs that are decent, also in contribution to the SDG 8, decent work. So decent jobs, attracting and creating ladders of opportunities within companies, and hotels are a perfect environment to do so, but also training underprivileged groups to get those skills, whether it's job skills or personal skills, that will help them get better jobs within the hotel industry or in the service industry in general. And in terms of doing that collectively, the hotel industry, so not just us, Carlson Residor, but all the major hotel brands, we have come together and we have defined 4 targets for 2030. And those targets are carbon, water, youth employment or tackling youth unemployment, and human rights. So these are the 4 topics which for all the major hotel companies we will work on intensively by 2030 in line with the SDGs.
Thank you very much. Nikki, you were the disruptor, so I have to come back to you. I accept that the issues vary from destination to destination, but you have experience of a lot of destinations. What are the main issues that come up in these different destinations? Accepting that they're different everywhere, what are the things that come up again and again?
Waste comes up regularly. Water issues come up in different parts of the world. Said it's not; these aren't common across the destinations at all. And that's why I was provoking you earlier, because said they are very different in different destinations. And I'll also take the element of over-tourism, but balancing it with the crisis management side as well, because I think we're all suddenly talking about over-tourism. You look at what's suddenly happened in Barcelona these last couple of weeks, and actually suddenly there's a fear of lack of tourists. likewise with the Caribbean, some very packed destinations there, suddenly again, lack of tourists coming. So it's somehow, again, drawing back to the destination management, is looking at how you can react to a crisis and keep a destination going when something happens to it in that way as well. Because that is a really common issue that we're facing, that is about linking all into the side of jobs, good employment, local economic development. If we suddenly have to disappear out of a destination, that has a huge impact as well.
Martin, could we just come back to you on the over-tourism question, because I think it links with what Nikki was just saying, in the sense that there's a difference between the problem that Barcelona or Venice has with over-tourism is serious and it's difficult, but they would survive a 20% drop in tourism reasonably well. It wouldn't destroy the local economy. But places like the Gambia, where you and I have worked together, and particularly some Caribbean islands and so on, where if tourism dropped by even 15%, it would be disastrous. I mean, that's an area of the over-tourism issue with dependency that there hasn't perhaps been enough attention paid to. And it links, I think, very nicely with Nikki's point about crisis management.
Yes, I think it's quite difficult, really, because we have the idea of over-tourism is that too many people going.
Yeah.
And therefore we're saying what measures can be taken to change that. And for any people who are not familiar with what is being done in Barcelona, it's extraordinary cutting-edge stuff which is being done by the city council. It's absolutely remarkable. So you begin to see that the effects of too many people is not just too many people coming in the day, which is one of the problems for Venice, for example, but it is too many people suddenly finding themselves in residential areas because of these platforms, Airbnb, etc., where whole blocks of flats have been taken over by tourists in residential areas. So they're having to recast all their thinking about urban planning and so on, so that there's a proper balance obtained, even in these more areas which are more distant from the centre. Now, the question, therefore, about over-tourism then becomes, how do we actually design, in this case, cities as tourism cities, with all these different aspects of different people not necessarily liking each other particularly, but getting along okay, because that's what we have to find a way of doing in big cities. And it's at the moment through what they call sensitivities, and a council which examines all these sensitivities of residents and so on, that you begin to find what is a sensible balance. Now, that kind of thinking, in my view, is the kind of thinking that needs to take place where there are many places in where there isn't over-tourism yet, but they still need the same thinking. And that's why I think the innovation which is taking place in Barcelona is so important, because it will help not only that example, but others as well, where we can then begin to see the social dimension being properly dealt with. I mean, in the Ministers' Summit, the minister from Costa Rica was talking about measuring the what he called the social index, social indicators, and finding whether or not in areas of high densities of tourism there were higher levels or lower levels of satisfaction of the residents with their quality of life. And I thought that is also something we need to look at very carefully. In the context of surviving crises, I've had to be involved in all sorts of different issues relating to crises, and it's extremely difficult to re-emerge from those crises. But there are very often some fundamental issues involved, like how do you build houses to withstand hurricanes, for example, but also the sheer resilience of people locally in being able to overcome the problems that they've had through tsunamis or whatever the issue may be. And I am always immensely impressed when I have been to these places and seen the sheer resilience of people in times of catastrophe. And somehow or other, we in tourism should make certain that we help and assist people in those situations to get back again. So that's the crisis management issue, that the way I would see it.
Thanks very much. We've got about 20 minutes left. Are there any questions from the floor, or does anybody want to put other issues on the agenda?
I speak Malta, don't
It's being filmed, so we need to get it down the tube.
Hi, this is a question for any one of you. I'm surprised no one's made reference to food and the idea of locally sourced and moving away from processed food. So.
I think in fairness, Jane, he did, but do you want to reiterate the point? Yeah, you did.
Can you pass the microphone?
Food separately, I think food falls under resources, absolutely, and it falls under reducing waste, 100%. So it is something that we need to be very mindful of, and it also falls under inclusive communities, because if you source your food locally, to a certain extent, you create also that benefit and economic benefit and strong structuring in local communities. So I don't see it singled out, but for me it's part of resources and resilient communities. And I think in the hotel industry we have done, and in my company in Carlson Resort we have done things around food waste, because we know a lot of the food is wasted, about 30% globally. So we have taken initiatives like changing the setup of our breakfast buffet with less but higher quality products which are more locally sourced, and that alone has reduced the waste by 27% every day for every guest that takes a breakfast in our upper upscale brand. So there are initiatives about measuring, tracing, and keeping food local, because I think it's a very good point you make.
If I can just, if I can just add, I think what's really interesting with our customer research, and we do customer research every couple of years, quite extensive in the 6 biggest European source markets that we have, and I think sustainability and customer desire and interest really correlates when it comes to food. So customers are increasingly interested in food waste and increasingly interested in local and authentic dishes and eating out in the local communities. So I think it's a win-win situation in terms of what customers are looking for, what gives them a more rewarding holiday, and what can also drive greater economic benefit. And the work that we do with our hotels through sustainability certifications such as Travel Life, I see Søren there in the audience from Travel Life, and other GSTC recognised certifications really puts the onus on hotels to look for more local sourcing options for things like particularly fruit, vegetables, dairy, and local specialities, wine, olive oil, jams, etc.
Yes, all of you mentioned environmental sustainability as a top priority over the next 5 years in one way or the other. I was shocked when I came in today that the program came in a huge plastic bag, and we're sitting in front of a table full of plastic water bottles. I know this isn't directed towards you, individual companies here, but I just want to point out that irony. And maybe something could be done at the next WTM about that.
You're not the first person to point that out. Who's next? One here, and then I'll come over to you, Rebecca.
Hello. My firm, together with the ITP, authored the Hotel Decarbonization Report. So going to the top there, the topic of carbon. That scenario was based on the sectoral decarbonization approach, which is very interesting to look at because it basically says, okay, if every major sector on the planet takes its part and its chunk and contributes, we can decarbonize. Also means that basically no one sector can do it alone, right? So even if travel and tourism became carbon neutral, it doesn't help. However, the one transversal component across all industries, all sectors, is the electric power grid. So basically, the planet's decarbonization hinges upon the power grid decarbonizing. So my question, getting to it, is given that tourism is going to grow, we're not going to stop it, and biofuels and electric planes probably not viable in the next 10 years, which are the crucial years of this decarbonization. would it be possible for tourism as an industry to say, look, why don't we support the one thing that is across all sectoral decarbonization, the electric power grid, and work toward the 5, 10, 15, 20 different various solutions that are out there to help decarbonize, electrify, and reduce carbon emissions from the power grid, even though airlines and aviation cannot really do anything to decarbonize in the next few years? Could we focus the attention on the power grid?
Well, clearly the power grid is one key element within all of this because it is a grid. But there are also other sources of electricity or other alternative ways of providing energy which are not directly involved in the grid. The grid obviously is extremely important within one country, but it's not by any means the only way. And if you look in parts of Africa and so on, you will find that there are places which are very individual in the way in which they have solar power and so on. So it's not a grid system in some of the countries in Africa. So it's I wouldn't say we need. I agree with you that electrification is an extremely important element, and of course it's how that electricity is produced that we need to be concerned about. But I don't see it as the only one, I must say.
Hello, I feel that I might have become the waste lady of tourism, which is a bit like becoming the bag lady of tourism. So I'm going to pose a question about food waste. I'd be very interested to hear from the hoteliers, I think, about the issue of food waste. We know that food waste prevention can reduce buffet-related food waste by about 20% if you look through the chain. And I'd like to understand how the responsible tourism agenda fits with the brand standards agenda so we can effectively work to target waste prevention in terms of the range of products as well as the volume of products to actually reduce the amount of food waste that comes from our buffets.
I think that's probably one for Carlson Residor.
Thank you for bringing this up, Rebecca. But before we go into that, I just want to point out that Just a Drop, wave, Brendan, you are over there, which is the charity of WTM and is also a charity that we support. They offer renewable water bottles, reusable water bottles and water stations across the event, so you don't need to drink out of the plastic bottles. But coming back to food waste, I think you're absolutely right, Rebecca, that we need to do more. It is also in educating our guests. I mentioned our breakfast buffet at Radisson Blu before. It's about measuring, it's about awareness in the hotels, so we measure in all our hotels. That alone has reduced the waste, the food waste, by 20% just by measuring what goes into the bin. And I think it's also very much an awareness point of view when we talk to, for instance, meeting and event clients. Because what the other lady brought up about this big meeting and event, this is a big event. So why do we need plastic bags? Why do we need PET water bottles? It's the same thing with the buffets. If we can educate our clients to make sure that they don't demand the abundant buffet, but that they accept a buffet where there are more vegetarian options, where there are more local options, and where the buffet is replenished as we go, instead of just putting everything out there. I think we come a long way together with the measuring and the awareness in the hotels.
Martin, do you want to? Sorry, can the microphone come back? It's coming.
No, Harold, I wanted to, if it was possible, to just address this issue about water. Is there anybody here from Cyprus? No, that's a shame. I remember when we were talking about water in Cyprus, we had a presentation which was made, and this was some years ago, and the tourism was about 5% of water consumption. Local residents were about 7%, and 83% was agriculture. Now, they're a country which have some limitation on water, and therefore they need to manage it very carefully. But it's a very interesting figure. So the opportunities actually for tourism to make a major difference to that is relatively limited. Not that they should ignore it, but it should be limited. So when we talk about water, we've got to make certain that we are really considering places which in themselves have a shortage of water, and therefore we must be, as tourists and providers of supplies of services for tourists, very aware of that. But there are other areas which are much more significant actually within the country, which, if they address some of those things, would make a much bigger difference.
I've looked at Malta in the same way, Martin, and the issue is very similar there. And the problem is that the agriculture is basically exporting embedded water in the vegetables and so on. Yeah. And it may be more efficient to give up on the agriculture and focus on the tourism. But that isn't going to be politically very easy to achieve. Are there any more questions? There's a gentleman here.
Thank you. First of all, let me thank our presenters for what they have said. I hope it will not be controversial. I come from East Africa. East Africa being around Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, South Sudan, and Uganda. So there we have many national parks, which are in almost all countries, and we have reserves. For neighboring of parks and reserves is in general rural poor areas where actually we have a kind of conflict between national parks and reserves protection and socio-economic development of the surrounding population, because most of the population would want to go in the parks to benefit from the products which are there, and this will create somehow a kind of conflict between protection and the socio-economic development. All these matters are around that. Environmental sustainability can only be there when, of course, you have the population around satisfied. The issue now is when it comes to the carbon credit. Debates have been held around actually taking national reserves, taking national forests and parks as eligible for carbon credit. And the concern, this has in several cases not been accepted, but we foresee the importance of actually allowing this to be eligible so that the population around can benefit from actually these parks which are there, these reserves which are there. My request here, as people engaged in the tourism sector, is to be right and honest advocate of rural people who are around these parks and reserves which are often visited, so that they can benefit from actually this amount of money which is potentially spoken about, but not in general cases easily accessible. Can you be the right and honest advocate? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a difficult question. Who'd like to try and answer? Minister?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much. In South Africa, as a country, is the third biggest biodiverse country, and we have a lot of parks under government, Some of them cut across different countries, and we have what we call transfrontier national parks, where we work then with different countries. But I just want to make a reference onto what we are doing besides the legislation and the other things that make us to conserve such parks. But those parks are also tourist attractions of the country. That's where a lot of our tourists visit for safari. There are establishments for accommodation and all of that. Government has used those parks to also allow for concessions with the communities, so that communities around the parks can also participate and have ownership of the parks themselves. Some of the land, as the park started, got taken away forcefully from communities. And there was a dispensation that then allowed that land to get back to the communities. But communities, because they have seen the value of what those parks are, did not just want to take it back and take down the fences. Instead, they wanted to participate. So government had to take lead in ensuring that that gets designed, they become part. So from the National Department of Tourism, what is currently happening is that as part of our program where we provide infrastructure, the skills and everything, we allow and we have a fund where we open those gates and infrastructure that would then allow tourists to use community entrances so that they also visit the communities outside of the parks. So it works very well, and it's a program that then empowers our communities. And as part of the concessions, they also have jobs that are created, but they learn, and it creates awareness around the environment even amongst the communities. So they own up, they also value the kind of parks and what the country offers.
Thank you very much indeed, Minister. I'm afraid we're now out of time. We do need to clear the room fairly quickly, but if I could thank the panel. I was very grateful for the depth of thought you've given to your answers, including Nikki, the disruptor. I think it's quite right to be disruptive. Sorry, could we just flick back to the results, or have they gone off? We will publish something about this on the WTM website. What occurs to me is that there's a quite strong, there's really two sets, aren't there? There's the ones about carbon and resource efficiency and environmental sustainability. Then there's another set which are about social responsibility, destination management, local economic benefit, and inclusive tourism. And with that, I think tourist safety, because I think that's part of that agenda. And that gives us lots of scope for the development of the programme here over the next 5 years. So thank you very much for your contribution. And could we thank the really excellent panel that we've had today in the usual way? Thank you very much indeed.